That's what we want to do here. The deep sessions.
Well, let's actually pull on a thread from something you said on stage before we left. How you want people to embrace loving this country, and how Bitcoin really represents the core principles, the values that made America so great. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean? Because a lot of people have lost faith in America. They've lost faith in the American dream, in its institutions. So how will Bitcoin fix this?
Well, look, I think actually going back to the birth of Bitcoin is pretty interesting here. I think people lost faith in the American dream in the aftermath of a man-made 2008 financial crisis, and it was absolutely a man-made crisis, followed by bailouts, by the way, by a Republican Party. People forget about this. The 2008 bailouts were actually committed, a sin committed by the US Republican Party. And in the aftermath of that, people say, well, this isn't really capitalism. This isn't the true American founding value set. So we're going to turn to something else. So I think part of that hunger for so many people who love actual, not only capitalism, but the unapologetic pursuit of excellence without the government picking favorites along the way, said if that's really the way they're going to play the game, even the Republican Party's going to play the game, we're going somewhere else. And Satoshi came out with what he did. It was not an accident. History comes out of the series of events that precede it. Ideas are born not in a vacuum, but in a historical context. That's actually what led to the birth of Bitcoin. So part of what we've seen now is many people, even in the United States of America, putting their faith in something else than the American founding. But actually, they're still channeling the spirit of the American founding. That's what's actually lifted Bitcoin up. The idea that you have an opt-out from an otherwise corrupt system. An opt-out, since we're going deep here, I'll maybe take a word to talk about what we didn't talk about on stage, which is the sins committed by the Federal Reserve over the course of the last 27 to 30 years in this country, which nominally has existed to protect the American worker and the everyday American. But the reality is they've been trying to hit two targets with one arrow, badly missing on both, that is inflation and unemployment. They've actually been hostile to wage growth in this country, where they've tightened monetary policy every time wages go up, as though that's a leading indicator of inflation, when in fact, wages are the last thing to go up in a business cycle, which means they've tightened monetary policy right into a downturn of the business cycle, which gives us those boom-bust bailout cycles, exactly what we saw in 2008. And so yes, do we need to constrain the scope of the Federal Reserve through the front door, through a new administration? Absolutely we do. But if that hasn't happened, in the meantime, an alternative and an opt-out out of that system was born. And so to understand the way Bitcoin embodies the true American dream and the values underlying it, we don't have to speculate about the future. I think we can look to the past, tracing back to its birth itself, which frankly is what drew me intellectually, certainly, into this in the first place.
What would you like to see happen with the central bank? Because a lot of Bitcoiners, they're frustrated at all of the money that's been printed that has led to asset inflation, which doesn't keep up with the pace of wages. And so people are not able to afford homes and retirement and healthcare. How can Bitcoin sort of repair this? Is it because it economically empowers the average person?
Well, look, I know Michael Saylor was on here not long before us when we walked in here, and he's done a great job of explaining how the degradation in value of an asset is different depending on what type of asset you own. And you think about the degradation of value or the holding cost, the maintenance cost even of Bitcoin is fundamentally in a different place than even, let's say, land or other forms of property. But I think it is deeper than that. The question is what you want to see out of the Federal Reserve was your question. Let me answer that. I think we need to radically constrain the mandate of the US Fed. The mandate of the US Fed needs to go back to one single goal: stabilize the US dollar as a unit of measurement by pegging it to a basket of commodities, period. Do that, you actually unleash economic growth in this country. The dollar isn't wildly fluctuating. And I do believe, in the due course of time, one of those commodities, gold, silver, nickel, you could talk about agricultural or farm commodities, I do think that Bitcoin, because of its finite supply, can and should be a part of that commodity basket that you peg the US dollar to. That ties the hands of the Fed. It ties the hands of the federal government. People offer this as a counter-argument, saying that if you actually peg the dollar to a basket of commodities, you lose the ability to adopt flexible monetary policy. What they view as a bug, I view as the feature. right? You want to use this to actually tie the hands of the federal government and the Federal Reserve. And when I talk about three-letter agencies, it's not just FDA, SEC, FTC, EPA. It's FED also on that list when we talk about actually radically constraining the scope of the federal government. Now, how do you do this practically? There's 23,000 employees at the U.S. Federal Reserve today. You don't need, if the sole mission of the Federal Reserve is to stabilize the U.S. dollar as a unit of measurement, you don't need 23,000 employees. You don't need 90+% of them. 90% headcount reduction on day one of a new administration. I think that that's appropriate. And you know what? Part of the beauty of this is you give a bunch of people a job. You tell them to come to work when they shouldn't have had that job in the first place. The problem is they start finding things to do. So in some ways, the overpopulation of the federal bureaucracy is itself actually the root cause, because they start taking on mandates they shouldn't have taken on in the first place. And I don't care if that's the FDA or the FTC or the SEC or the FED, that's part of the root cause in the original principle. 75% massive headcount reduction is what I favored in my presidential candidacy, and I'd like to see something of that scale in a second Trump term as well.
What's the right balance between encouraging free market competition and also ensuring that consumers are protected?
Yeah. So first of all, there is a private tort system that stops you from, at least gives you a cause of action against a company that sells you something but says, hey, the thing in here isn't actually what you said it was. You can sue that company, right? Take a product, take product liability, take a medicine that was supposed to help you, instead it kills you, or a vaccine, or whatever the case may be. Actually, for vaccine manufacturers, the irony is they actually gave vaccine manufacturers a special shield of liability, but for normal products, you have an opportunity to sue a manufacturer who either defrauded you or sold you something that hurt you. I think it's a perfectly reasonable way to handle consent-based systems. You can't lie to somebody. You can't defraud somebody saying you're actually giving them something when in fact you give them something else. That does not require the existence of a Consumer Protection Financial Bureau or a CFPB or any other three-letter or four-letter agency to stand in the way. So how do you strike that balance? I'd say I'd give you two answers to that question. One is leave it decentralized to the system of private causes of action in the first place, which you already have. But the second thing is you're always going to take some risk. Let's be very honest about that. One risk is you don't cut enough fat. You have an 8-headed hydra in the federal government, you cut off one of the heads, it grows right back. The other risk you take is that you cut so much that you also end up cutting some muscle. We have to acknowledge that's a risk. The only question is, which risk are you willing to take? Which risk is in the best interests of our country? And speaking for my part, not to just paint a rosy picture for the sake of painting a rosy picture, but be honest about what risk we're willing to take. The risk that I am willing to take is the risk of cutting so much that we also risk cutting some muscle. That's the risk I'd rather take than the risk of not cutting enough in the first place, or else the job is never actually going to get done.
All right, I think we're going to open it up to some
Yeah,
questions
let's do
from
that.
the audience.
You got a guy right here. I like your hat, man.
Jimmy Song.
Jimmy.
Thank you. Love what you're saying before. I would love to know your thoughts on the Bitcoin strategic reserve that President Trump recently.
So one thing I will say is everything in that speech, I know how President Trump works. I've had a chance to, I've gotten to know him really well in the last 6 months. He and I have had detailed conversations on a number of the subjects that you heard today. He didn't make that speech lightly. He thought about every input in there, and I think there was a lot of thought that went into that. I'll come to your question in 1 second, but one prediction I want to make is in the wake of that speech, you mark my words on this, let's see in another 2 weeks if I'm right about this, and maybe give you 2 months. The Democrats are going to put up, in response to this, something they otherwise never would have, which is some sort of thin, I predict phony version of a crypto or digital asset policy. They would have never done it had today not happened. Don't buy it when you see it. So everything in there was serious. The way I view the reserve is, that was a good starting point for a conversation we ought to have. Right? I think there are risks to doing this in a way that recreates some of the same government intervention that puts the government in charge of Bitcoin's future, our future, in ways that we don't want to see replicate itself. But was that a good catalyst for the kind of conversation we should be having in the years ahead? I think it was. And that successful mission on that narrow point, I think, was accomplished. It's a great question, but to view today as the starting point or the jumping off point for a conversation, not a destination. In contrast to a lot of the other policy commitments, which I do view as just a worthy destination that was already well defined that you heard on that stage. You know, firing certain members of the administrative state that have been hostile, working outside of the boundaries of the existing law. You think about the way in which we want to stand against a central bank digital currency. That was a hard pledge that we will never see the advent of a CBDC in the United States. In the case of the strategic reserve, I view that as a starting point, a catalyst for future conversation. That's the way I took it.
Hi, Vivek, evangelistmark@bitcoinuniversity.org. I have a question that a lot of people here probably kind of quietly wondering to themselves. Why do you think Trump didn't choose you for vice president?
I can't speculate on President Trump's psychology. What I will say is, I respect him immensely. I ran for president because I do believe this country is in dire straits, and I did my part over the course of the last year. I ran as an unknown 37-year-old when I declared, and I'm proud of what we accomplished. I think the fact that somebody coming from the outside who nobody had ever heard of, but with the right pro-liberty vision for this country, can beat out former vice presidents and senators and governors, says less about me and the power of what's possible in this country. You know, President Trump, best advice I could give him is pick whoever you're most comfortable with in serving in the role that you envision. In my conversations with him, we're aligned that whatever I'm going to do next, whether it's in the administration or some other role, and there are other opportunities that have emerged in recent weeks, it's going to be whatever has the maximal impact on the country at scale. And I do think that JD, even though he's a good friend, I don't agree with him on every policy, no two people do. I know him for a very long time. He's a good man. I respect him. And I think he is going to make for an outstanding vice president, of somebody who's truly energetic and honest in who he really is. And so that's what I'll say about him. Thank you.
Is there a role in the administration you're most intrigued about?
You know, I think probably yes, but I want to be respectful of the conversations I've had with President Trump. But what I will say is, what he and I are aligned on is it's not going to be something of small impact or modest impact. It's going to be something of seismic impact, and that's what we're rooting for. My passion in my presidential campaign, and it remains my passion today, is not how do you reform the administrative state, not how do you tinker around the edges of a regulatory state, but how you actually get in there and gut the regulatory state. How you get in there and actually shut it down. That's what this country requires. And there's a path to doing that, a requirement to do that through the executive branch. There's also real groundwork that needs to be laid legislatively as well, through the Senate and otherwise. And so I think both paths remain open, both paths are important. And I think President Trump and I are going to pick the one for my next step. Certainly I'm going to pick the one for the next step that has the biggest impact on the country.
Another question over here? Yes. So thank you for taking questions.
Thanks.
I heard Edward Snowden's speech when he was talking, and one of the things that he brought to my attention was that there's certain metadata around Bitcoin transactions that is still able to be collected and analyzed by AI and different technologies. So my question for you is, what risk is there with that metadata that's not privatized surrounding Bitcoin transactions, and what can we do to prevent governments all over the globe from analyzing and weaponizing that data against the people that use Bitcoin?
Sure. So my general policy approach of strong libertarian leaning is the presumption should be it's not the technology that's bad, it's the user of the technology when it's the government that actually acts in contrary to the interests of liberty. So one of the things I'll say about Edward Snowden is he's a guy, but for him, we would still be living with a pillow cover on our heads with respect to the abuses of the national security state. And I don't speak for anyone else but myself here when I say this, but I believe he deserves clemency. And I think that that's something that is an appropriate step to take, to at least stand for the exposing the exposure of work that he's done for this country, despite a lot of debates around that. But my point is, focus less on our concern about what technologies exist for surveillance, because the government has far overreached its bounds even preceding the existence of those technologies in the first place. What we need is more accountability for government actors who break the law. There's not one standard of the rule of law for ordinary citizens and another one for bureaucrats. I think if we have a government that has to apply itself to the same set of rules that citizens are bound by, then all of the problems with the surveillance state mostly melt away. This is not a Republican versus Democrat point. In fact, I think a lot of Republicans are culpable here. You have Republicans on one hand that will throw a big fit about the weaponization of government, and maybe I'm one of them. I am one of them. But you also have some of those Republicans, and I'm against this, that also expand the toolkit that the government has to weaponize those same tools of government, voting for the expansion of FISA 702. So that, I think, is a real problem. The expansion of FISA 702 is a far bigger problem. It wasn't a reauthorization, it was an expansion. That, I think, is the real problem that I'm more worried about, not the existence of particular types of algorithms that would allow somebody to gain higher resolution analysis of metadata. That could be used for good for a lot of purposes too. The thing we need to focus on is actually constrain the power of the government itself that abuses those tools. That's where I believe we need to focus. Get a little louder for me, man.
I just want to know if you're a Bitcoiner. Do you own Bitcoin?
Do I own Bitcoin? Yes. I think I might have been the first presidential candidate, certainly as a Republican, that in my financial disclosure forms reported that long before I ran. And that's one of the things I said in there is, I think part of this is going to have to be a market structure development as well, where most ordinary Americans, even if you got the federal government out of the way, are not aware of the existence of Bitcoin, what it is. And I do think that part of this is going to be an opportunity for entrepreneurs, even after the government intervention or whatever's out of the way, to be able to say it's not just operating within the four corners of this room and building technology for the kinds of people who might show up at this conference, but what are the rails we build to educate a broader general public to be able to make the choice for themselves of how they're going to incorporate Bitcoin or other forms of cryptocurrency into a well-balanced portfolio for the long run. That's missing today. Most wealth managers across this country, I don't mean to be rude about this, but are Luddites when it comes to even the existence of Bitcoin or what it means. And so I think that the good news is it's not something to cry about. That's an opportunity for a whole generation of entrepreneurs to build those rails. You're not asking for my advice as an entrepreneur, but I'm going to give you one anyway, which is that I think the most fruitful and valuable opportunities in the new Bitcoin economy will not be those at the center of it, but those at the edge of it, to be able to expand its utilization by people who otherwise would have never thought about it. I think there's a lot of convexity around the Trump election in November for not only the future of Bitcoin, but the future of cryptocurrency, in part because it's not just going to be the policy shift, but you hear a potential 47th president of the United States give a speech like the one he just gave here. It's not just the policy shift. It's the shift of 70, 80 plus million people who are deeply committed to President Trump and his America First vision for the country, who now say, okay, this is now something that I previously didn't trust, that I now can. And I think that too is a cultural shift in the attitudes towards Bitcoin, as much as it will be a regulatory shift that actually matters a lot to the future. But anyway, to answer your first question, did I own it before I ran for president? Yes, was the answer to that question.
All right, 2 more questions.
I got one right there. Oh, someone right here.
Hey Vivek, I just want to let you know I'm a pretty big fan.
Thanks, man.
And I just want to know what your thoughts are on, I guess, the position that President Trump talked about. He said he was going to create a secretary of Bitcoin and cryptocurrency or something, and sort of what they'd be able to do with that. And also, will you? I realize that you lost, but will you continue fighting for this country, essentially?
I can give you that promise right now. We will not stop fighting for this country until we get the job done, and I take that in a very personal way. So you have my word on that. And what we got started with my campaign over the last year, I'll give you this promise too. That is just an early warm-up of what's going to come. Okay, so this is a future that's going to outlive not just the next 4 years, but the next 250 years for this country. Now, I think what President Trump talked about on stage, I think specifically what he referred to was, I forget the exact word, but sort of an advisory council was what he committed to as an immediate course of action. I think there's a lot of great people in that room who could actually be part of it. I don't think he was kidding when he said, who in this audience wants to volunteer and be part of it? But I don't want to see it stop there. A lot of times what you see in the federal government is you see the creation of some joint working group of this or that. It's always a great first step. Make no mistake, I'm in favor of that as a first step. But what you want to make sure is you don't recreate some type of new bureaucracy committee class that really doesn't move the ball forward but continues to spin in circles. That's usually what you see happen in the federal government. So what I want to see happen is the first step is I don't think we need to create anything. The first step is we need to actually destroy, I think, a lot of the obstacles that have stood in the way. Deconstruct the existing government bureaucracy. And when you think about major positions, Marsha Blackburn talked about this on the stage. One of them that I think could be good is somebody who's responsible for the massive, like not small, but massive downsizing of the federal bureaucracy. The number of regulations, the number of bureaucrats, and yes, accountability for the bureaucrats who overreach their scope. Bitcoin is a part of that, but really only just a small part of that. And I do think that that's an opportunity to drive major regulatory reform in the country. So that's what I'd say, man.
One final question.
Vivek, first of all, man, I want to thank you for the personal sacrifice you've made
Thank you.
in the political arena. I know a lot of guys in the private sector don't want to do that, both monetarily and with regards to your family. I think you've been one of the best orators and communicators of the American dream and the American
Thank you, man.
values. And
I appreciate it.
You have like the Gen Z support, the millennial support. I know that in all my social circles, you were the VP choice that we all wanted.
Thank you. Thank you, man. Take that in a good way.
So my question is, will you consider running in 2028?
Look, we have, I don't mean to be this some sort of cop-out like kind of way. We have something major that's about to happen in this country in 100 days. So I have truthfully, to all the questions about the plan of U.S. Senator or cabinet or this or that or future beyond that, one of the things I've found in my life is every time I've made a long-run plan at an earlier stage of my career, it never goes according to that plan anyway. It just doesn't, right? Your plans are stupid, okay? That's probably as true for you as it is for me, but it's definitely true for me. But where I have been at my best is when you're called by your sense of purpose, the plan tends to reveal itself, and it's up to you to follow it. And so I am still called by the same purpose that led me to run for president last year. It is to revive our national identity, and it is to get in there and shut down the federal bureaucracy. Those are two things I believe the U.S. president can and must do, and I remain called by that purpose in whatever I do next. That's the word I'll give you. In the meantime, let's win an election this November, save this country. And for the same reasons you love Bitcoin, I love the United States of America, and I know you guys do too. So thank you guys. God bless you, and God bless our great country. Natalie, thank you.
Thank you. Good to see you. Good to see you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Great.
Good luck with everything.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, guys. Going this way? Going this way?